28th, 1963, 200,000 Americans came to Washington to demand complete freedom for everyone.
Well, we all live black and white, trying to fight for equal rights. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on, hold on, hold on, hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on, hold on.
Greetings to my brothers and sisters who have decided to gather for the 57th anniversary of the March on Washington, the March for Jobs and Freedom, to give a charge today from an event that happened in yesteryear. We must first remember correctly. We must re-radicalize the March on Washington in our memories for this time, because far too often it has been corporatized and commercialized as an event far less radical than it actually was. In our collective memory, the March on Washington has even been viewed as a one-issue day, or as just a black day, as if the only reason people came together in 1963 was to demand the civil rights bill we got in 1964. But actually, this undercuts the meaning and the power of the original March on Washington. And when we do so, when we reduce its demands in our memory, if we falsely remember the fullness of why people gathered 57 years ago, then it is hard for us to give a charge from that day that fits the reality of our day. So let us remember properly. The March on Washington was not wanted when it was announced. It was feared. It was feared in the white community, even feared by some in the black community. An editorial in the New York Herald Tribune warned that if Negro leaders persist in their announced plans to march 100,000 strong on the Capitol, they will be jeopardizing their cause. The ugly part of this particular mass protest is its implication of unconstrained violence if Congress does not deliver it. They did not see the enemies of this march as nonviolent, peaceful. They saw it as a precursor to unconstrained violence and sought to do everything they could to stop it. Even President Kennedy called the leaders in and asked them not to meet and not to march. The March on Washington was on August 28th because that was the day Emmett Till had been killed 8 years earlier, murdered brutally with a cotton gin tied around his body as he was thrown into the river. Young people who knew they had to organize, young people who were rising up all over this nation in mass nonviolence against systemic racism, some of them were facing life sentences and even death sentences for simply marching for justice. The March on Washington was 36 days after the death of Medgar Evers, the murder of Medgar Evers. It was 18 days before the murder and the brutal bombing and slaying of 4 little girls in a Birmingham church. The original demands of the march was not one issue. It was for jobs with an S and freedom. King's speech, which we remember now as I Have a Dream, was actually titled Normalcy Never Again. Direct actions were taking place in over 600 cities across the nation. The March on Washington was not merely one person calling people to come to hear a person or persons speak. It was growing out of the movements that were happening around the nation. The goal was to change the narrative. The March on Washington was designed and timed to push Kennedy, who had been elected by a narrow margin, had benefited from the African American vote, but rather than acting in his first 100 days, For more than 2 years, he had not passed or pushed meaningful legislation to undo the vestiges of slavery and Jim Crow. The Civil Rights Movement, America's second Reconstruction, had begun in earnest on May 17, 1954, with the NAACP's Supreme Court decision and victory in Brown versus Board of Education that declared separate but equal unconstitutional. But 9 years later, public schools were still not desegregated. Racism and Jim Crow and violence were on the rise across the nation. Some black leaders and some white leaders and preachers offered words of sentimentality. Some politicians were very sentimental, saying that things were wrong and bad, but their sentiments had not translated into serious policy. And so, as James Baldwin would say, that kind of sentimentality had become a mask to hide the cruelties of systemic evils. And so we have to first properly remember the charge of that day in order to hear a fresh charge for our day. Yes, the organizers of the March on Washington wanted Kennedy and the federal government, they wanted them to enact a comprehensive Civil Rights Act. But they refused to allow their demands to be reduced to just one issue. As John Lewis would say, we want all of our freedom, and we want it now. They wanted legislation that stopped legalized discrimination and voter suppression. They wanted legislation that declared jobs and federal contracts were only for those who didn't discriminate. Their cry was for jobs and freedoms, justice and equality. And they wanted it all in one bill, not 50, not 20, but one act. They knew that 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, the Negro was still not free, America was still not free, and they needed that freedom now, and they needed it, all of it. They were organized by a gay activist, Bayard Rustin. Sadly and mistakenly, we must even criticize ourselves, no women spoke at the March on Washington, but there was a protest for women to speak. It was led by Anna Hedgeman, a mighty activist, feminist, womanist, a mighty activist for the poor, who recruited 40,000 Protestants to the march. And what was said on that day, if we really want to charge from that day to this day, what was said? Well, A. Philip Randolph said it like this: we are here today, and we're only the first wave. When we leave, it will be to carry the civil rights revolution home with us into every nook and cranny of the land, and we shall return again and again to Washington in ever-growing numbers until total freedom is ours. NAACP Executive Director Roy Wilkins said, we want legislation that affirms life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and quality employment. John Lewis said on that day, we must have legislation that will protect the Mississippi sharecropper who is put off of his farm because he dares to register to vote. We must have a bill that will provide for the homeless, the poor, and the starving people of this nation. John Lewis was the only one that day that was that clear about poverty and homelessness. He went on to say, we need a bill that will ensure the equality of a maid who earns $5 a week in a home of a family whose total income is $100,000 a year. We have to first remember the charge of that day, not allow it to be corporatized or commercialized or de-radicalized before we can give a charge for our day. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke of those crippled by the chains of discrimination, those on a lonely island of poverty, there's that word again, in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. Martin Luther King said, we have come to dramatize an appalling condition. To just think all he said was, I have a dream, and all he did was tell America about his dream, is to miss the radical charge of the March on Washington 57 years ago. Martin Luther King talked about a promissory note. He said America has defaulted on her promissory note, giving the Negro a bad check which has come back marked insufficient funds. And you know how you feel when you see someone that's giving you a bad check and then you see them riding around with your money and your check is still not cashing. That was the radical spirit. Martin was saying, you've lied to us. You've taken our free labor. You've taken all of the economic power that we've given this nation, and we've not seen what you promised come back. Then Martin went on to say, we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. In other words, we refuse to believe that there have to be so many on a lonely island of poverty. Then he said, listen, this is no time to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism, because they were already hearing people say, we'll just let them march, and after they march, we'll go back to usual. We'll just continue to let these bills march along slowly. We'll allow them to continue to be filibustered. Martin said, listen, if you think this is just a hot summer, a time for blowing off steam, listen what he said, America will have a rude awakening. If the nation returns to business as usual, there will be neither rest nor tranquility in America until citizens' rights are for everybody. The whirlwinds of revolt will continue to shake the foundations of our nation. This was the charge and the context of that day then. So what is the charge today? I think in a very real sense, much of it we still have to say. We must first repent of not living up to A. Philip Randolph's promise. We did not come back successively, larger waves, to insist that the issue of justice and economic inequality be dealt with. We did not come back wave after wave, bringing the poor and the sharecropper and the maid. Far too long we have attempted the normalcy of a racial caste system in America. Far too long we've been comfortable with a few black people in position or a few good white people in position. Far too long we have been comfortable with the normal legislative process where compromise rather than conviction becomes the order of the day. And when all is said and done, we have less than what we were promised over and over again. And so to truly repent is to turn. It is to face our past and receive the charge that echoes across our lives 57 years later. We still must say to America in no uncertain terms, America will have a rude awakening if this nation returns to business as usual. We do not need the politicians who get elected this time, particularly if they benefit from the African American vote and the poor vote and the white vote and the brown vote and those who want progress, to engage in the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. 57 years later, we still have to fight and challenge systemic racism in all of its forms, not just one form, police violence, but all of its forms. Voter suppression, police brutality, resegregation of our public schools, continuing mistreatment of our immigrant brothers and sisters, particularly from Latin America, and our First Nation indigenous brothers and sisters. We must, 57 years later, recognize that we have 140 million poor and low-income people in this country, 62 million not earning a living wage, 700 people dying a day from poverty before COVID. Before COVID. The whirlwinds of revolt must continue to shake the foundations of this nation. We have 87 million people without health care before COVID. Another 27 million have been added since COVID because they've lost their jobs. 40% of those making $40,000 and less have lost their jobs. That's our charge. We still have to fight. 4 million families get up every morning before COVID and could buy unleaded gas and not buy unleaded water. Tens of millions of people are homeless or on the verge of homeless. We spend $800 billion on war. You want to know where the money is for health care, the money for infrastructure, the money for living wage is in $800 billion being spent for war in peace times. If we cut that budget in half, we would have more money in our war budgets than China, North Korea, Iran, and Iraq, and Russia combined. 53 cents of every discretionary dollar going to war, and not to the soldiers and the disabled, but to the companies, the corporations, those who benefit from the war economy, those who build things the Pentagon doesn't even ask for. And less than 16 cents is going to infrastructure and healthcare and education. And then we have a religious nationalism that keeps trying to tell us that the only moral issues are being against the LGBT community, the gay community, being against women's rights to choose, being against prayer in the school, being for tax cuts. And then many of them even say being for guns, when we know that is not in line with our deepest moral, religious, and theological values. Our deepest moral and religious and theological values tell us that our focus should be the least of these. When I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was naked, did you clothe me? When I was sick, did you care about me? When I was an immigrant, did you invite me in? And so 57 years later, our charge is that we still have work to do. We can't be at ease in Zion. We can't be weary in well-doing. And we must remember what Jesus said: the race is not given to the swiftest nor to the strongest, but to they that endure to the end. The charge is 57 years later, we still have to demand. We have to demand and say that when George Floyd said, "I can't breathe," his words were compelling shorthand, exposing America's enduring systemic racism and poverty, that it continues, and the death that is wrapped up in all of these vicious policies of inequality: health care, denial of health care, wages, unemployment insurance, denial of full and funded education, denial of housing, denial of dealing with policing and criminal injustice, denying water equality and air quality and environmental safety. All of them have a death measurement in them. And all of them, like George Floyd said, leaves us saying, "I can't breathe." And so our charge now is we must breathe, and we must breathe new life into the cause of justice, the cause of equal protection under the law, the cause of promoting the general welfare and establishing justice and providing for the common defense. How do we do this? Our demand must be, we demand that this country protect and expand voting rights, and that we have a pre-clearance formula that catches all jurisdictions covered by the Voting Rights Act, and jurisdictions that have passed voter suppression laws since that weren't covered before. We must address police violence and mass incarceration and resegregation of our public schools. We must have meaningful recognition of indigenous sovereignty and the nationhood of our Apache, Navajo, and other indigenous brothers and sisters. 57 years later, we must demand health care for all. This includes Medicare for all, and expansion of Medicaid, and universal coverage right now for COVID treatment and for vaccines. This must include fully funding and expanding Indian health services to meet the need at hand. 57 years later, we must demand housing for all, expanding public housing and affordable housing, and expanding rental assistance. We must stop evictions and foreclosure. We must have a bill that protects people from becoming homeless, and bills that must protect the lands of the indigenous and native communities. 57 years later, we must demand jobs and income for all. We must demand the establishment of a federal jobs guarantee that can build up healthcare infrastructure and capacity, and schools and sanitation and water and climate infrastructure, including public transportation, and ensuring $15 an hour and a living wage, and guaranteed adequate incomes for those who cannot work. We must establish a strong welfare program to lift up those on the margin. We must deal with and prioritize poor and low-wealth communities that have suffered from the deindustrialization, and from rural communities and communities that are dependent on fossil fuels. We must have programs that include this guaranteed adequate income. We see it now. There's no way out of the damage of COVID. There's no way out of this Great Depression that we're in. There's no way out of it without a great destruction if we don't feed and give the money that is necessary for people to come up out of this. These things must be our demands. We must have a first 50-day agenda for the new administration that comes in, not a first 2-year agenda or first 100-day agenda. We must demand immigration reform. That must happen. We must ensure that our immigrant brothers and sisters are eligible for all public assistance and welfare programs, including health care and unemployment and housing and food security and child care programs and education and worker protection and the right to join unions. And we must be clear that we will not allow anybody that God made to be called an illegal alien or an illegal person. We must demand, and it must be made clear, that we will have cuts to the military and redirect those monies from the military and redirect some of the resources from policing to address the issue of immigration, and redirect money from prisons, and redirect money from a border wall, and redirect monies from the unfair tax cuts for corporations and Wall Street, and use that redirected money for investments to uplift communities that have been hurting. What else is our charge? In the face of a president absorbed in the asinine assumptions of his own misguided racist arrogance, enabled by all those who go along to get along, what is our charge? In the face of a Senate leader whose failures to restore the Voting Rights Act place him alongside the racist Southern senators like Strom Thurmond and Jesse Helms, a senator who has practiced in the 21st century his own version of interposition and nullification as the majority leader of the United States Senate in McConnell. What is our charge? Our charge is to simply and yet profoundly go forth and go forward. We must go forth and go forward. On that day 50 years ago, Dr. King said, go back. Since we're gathering digitally, we must say go forth and go forward. We must go forth and go forward, organizing from Appalachia to Black Alabama, from white Appalachia to Black Alabama, from Latino Texas to native Arizona, from Maine to Mississippi, from Kentucky to California, from Washington State to Washington, D.C. And our charge must be to organize and register people to vote. We must do more, mobilizing, organizing, registering people for a movement who vote, not just to vote, but for a movement who vote, a movement that will show up at the polls, and then after people are elected will show up in their offices and show up in their streets, demanding the justice that must be. We must put our works and faith together, because faith without works is dead, but faith with works is powerful. And 57 years later, we must remember something Dr. King would say 4 years after the March on Washington. And he said the only group who could form the massive restructure of American society would be for blacks, poor whites, progressive whites, working class people, and even recipients of welfare to come together in what Queen Latifah called UNITY. This may be the only coalition, he said, that could shift America's economic architecture and make the profound changes necessary to care for all her people. And sadly, we know it to be true, because 57 years later, because that coalition was never fully engaged, we still face the challenges we have today. And so we are charged from this moment to go forth and go forward, knowing that we have the power to unleash the power of the poor. We have the power. Poor and low-income people are 25% of the electorate. If just 1 to 19% of poor and low-income people of every race, creed, color, and sexuality would organize around an agenda and vote, it would change the political calculus in the country, even throughout the South. And if you change the South, you change the entire nation. We are charged to know and believe that black people and Latino people and native people and poor people have the political power to change the moral and political direction of this country. We are charged to fight for a bottom-up stimulus that gets those communities that are stuck in the mud unstuck and then causes them to rise. King said, go back. We must say, go forth and go forward. We must go forth and forward knowing that this is the moment that we've been granted to be alive in this moment, that COVID-19 is forcing all of us to understand how much we need each other and how much it is a national security not to address the issue of racism and poverty. For this virus is exploiting the wounds of systemic racism and poverty. If we had addressed them before the virus would not have the power that it has. But since we didn't, in the midst of this, now we are being called to address it like never before. And so I know that forward together, we can replace all of this ugly stuff with a call that will establish justice and reparations for all. I know forward together, we can make it so every vote is free, full, and never abridged by any state or any discrimination or suppression anywhere. I know forward together, every person can have health care attached to the worth of their humanity and not to the profit of a corporation. I know forward together, we will make it so that the work that we do means you have a living wage and you have labor rights. I know forward together, the least of these can be lifted and helped, and we can do it as though we are helping God's self, because we are. I know forward together, we can take care of the air and the water and the land as though it is all God's gift and not to be used as a focus of our greed. I know forward together, children can be loved and lifted and educated and never abused and mistreated. I know forward together, our First Nation, indigenous families can be treated as the nations they are and fully restored. I know forward together, immigrants can be welcome. We can still say, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be free. I know forward together, we can tear down unjust walls. We can tear down detention centers. We can destroy all of the things that destroy God's humanity, and we can build up justice. I know that forward together, we can stop the murders of our sons and daughters by racist police or any criminal that dares to kill our children and our people in our community. I know forward together, we with God's help can build a third Reconstruction that overturns the long train of abuses, the long train of injustices, and that we can fully secure life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness for all. I know forward together, and I believe forward together, one can still chase 1,000, and two can still put 10,000 to flight. I know forward together, I believe forward together, that the lion can still lay down with the lamb. I still believe that forward together, wrapped up in the Spirit of God, crucifixions of wrong and inequality can be turned to mighty movements of transformation. I know forward together, this land is your land and this land is my land. I know forward together, black and white and brown and red and yellow and gay and straight and every color and every creed and every race and every geography, we can shake and reshape the very foundations of this nation. I know forward together, no hope is too unbelievable. No height is too unreachable. When it comes to justice, no dream is too impossible. When it comes to doing what's right, no goal is unattainable. Forward together must be our charge and the way we go forth and go forward. Forward together, keep your head up, as the brothers and the rappers say. Everybody has a right to live. And as the poet declared, Lord, grant us courage for the facing of this hour. Cure thy children's warring madness. Bend our pride to thy control. Shame our wanton selfish gladness. Rich in things and poor in soul. Save us from weak resignation to the evils we deplore. Let the search for thy salvation, our glory, your glory forevermore. Forward together, forward together. That is our call. That is our mandate. forward together, forward together, forward together, and not one step back.
Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around, turn me around, turn me around. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. Keep on walking, keep on talking, marching up the freedom way.